The airplane cabin fell silent the moment the attendant's voice cut through the hum of engines and the murmur of passengers. "Move from the exit row," she demanded sharply, her eyes locking on the black woman seated confidently, a dark leather bag resting on her lap. Her tone was strict, impatient, and unmistakably condescending. The woman looked up slowly, unbothered by the authority in the attendant's voice, her gaze calm yet piercing, the kind that made people instinctively measure their words. A few passengers glanced over, sensing the rising tension, and the murmur of the cabin seemed to shrink into a suspended hush. "Just before we get back to it, I'm curious to know, where are you watching from today? And if these stories have been keeping you captivated, be sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one." I booked the whole flight," the woman said finally, her voice low but deliberate, carrying a weight that made every head turn. The attendant froze mid-step, mouth opening as if trying to form a sentence, but no words came. Her usual air of control vanished, replaced with a sudden, awkward hesitation. The passengers watched in disbelief, some stifling gasps, others leaning forward to see if it was a joke, but the woman's calm posture and unshakable composure left no room for doubt. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't exaggerating. She owned the plane, every single seat, every row from front to back, and now the entire cabin had to absorb the gravity of that truth. A few feet away, a young boy pressed his forehead against the window, staring at the clouds drifting lazily outside, oblivious to the unfolding drama. Yet the tension reached even him. The adult beside him shifted uneasily, sensing something extraordinary was happening that went far beyond ordinary flight etiquette. The attendant, still frozen, glanced toward the cockpit, hoping the pilot might rescue her from this nightmare. But the pilot, focused on safety and routine, did not intervene. The air felt electric, charged with the mix of fear, confusion, and curiosity that only a moment like this could conjure. The black woman leaned back in her seat, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips, one that suggested she had anticipated this reaction. Every motion, every subtle tilt of her head screamed confidence. The passengers, initially shocked, now began to whisper among themselves, their curiosity growing into fascination. Who was she? How could anyone possibly book an entire flight? And more importantly, why had she done it? Then, just as the attendant seemed to muster the courage to speak, the woman's phone rang sharply, breaking the silence. She picked it up with the same calm authority, her eyes scanning the cabin, and her smile widened ever so slightly. "Yes, they're all here," she said softly, barely above a whisper. The words were almost inconsequential, yet the way she said them made every listener hang on to each syllable. A chill ran down the spine of everyone watching, as if the cabin had suddenly transformed from a commercial flight into a scene from a suspense thriller. Somewhere deep in the back of the plane, a young woman quietly reached for her notebook, realizing she might be witnessing something extraordinary, a story that would be retold countless times. Outside the windows, the sky was a calm, pale blue, but inside, the tension had reached a point where the hum of the engines was no longer background noise. It was the drumbeat to a story that was only beginning to unfold. And just as the attendant opened her mouth again, trying to reclaim authority, the woman leaned forward slightly, eyes glinting with controlled mischief, and whispered something no one else could hear. The sound of it didn't travel far, but its effect rippled across the cabin, a silent warning that this flight was far from ordinary. No one knew it yet, but the drama that had erupted in the exit row was only the beginning. Behind the calm smile and quiet words lay a history of events that, once revealed, would change the way every passenger looked at her forever. Secrets so deep, so unexpected, that the ordinary flight they thought they had booked was about to become a journey none of them would ever forget. Before that fateful flight, she had lived a life that few could imagine. Her name was Monique Carter, a woman whose presence demanded attention without her ever asking for it. On the surface, she seemed like any other professional, polished, composed, and meticulously organized. But beneath that calm exterior lay a mind that was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. She had learned early on that the world often underestimated people who didn't fit the mold, and she had turned that underestimation into an advantage, quietly shaping her life and the lives of those around her. Monique had grown up in a small town where opportunities were scarce and assumptions about who people were ran deep. She had watched her family struggle, seen neighbors judged for appearances, and felt the sting of whispered doubts that questioned her intelligence and ambition. Those experiences had left their mark, but instead of breaking her, they had forged a resolve that was both sharp and unyielding. She moved through life observing patterns, predicting outcomes, and quietly orchestrating the steps she would need to take to secure her place at the top. Her career had begun in corporate America, climbing through the ranks of a powerful multinational company, where she quickly learned that rules were only as binding as people made them. She noticed how small gestures, confidence, timing, and knowing when to speak or stay silent could shift the balance of power in a room. Over time, she had built not just influence but a reputation that drew both admiration and envy. People often underestimated her because she never flaunted her achievements, but those who ignored her quickly learned that every decision she made carried weight. The idea to book the whole flight wasn't born out of whimsy or vanity. It was calculated, a statement designed to assert control in a world that had often tried to deny her authority. Monique had planned it meticulously, reserving every seat under her name through layers of accounts, making sure that the attendants, the crew, and even the airport staff had no idea until the very last moment. It was both a personal test and a message to the world. Assumptions could be challenged, authority could be redefined, and no one, not even the people trained to enforce rules, should ever underestimate her. That morning, as she arrived at the airport, she walked with the same quiet confidence that had defined her career. Passengers glanced at her, noting the poise in the way she held herself, the subtle elegance of her attire, and the sharpness in her eyes. No one suspected that this woman, seemingly ordinary to the casual observer, had orchestrated a situation that would leave an entire flight stunned. To her, it was just another step in a long journey of demonstrating that the world often responded to courage and clarity of purpose more than money or status alone. Even as she approached the gate, she could feel the small electric pulse of anticipation that came from knowing how events would unfold. There was satisfaction in the knowledge that people would react exactly as she expected, shocked, unsure, and slightly afraid to challenge her. But beyond that, there was a deeper motivation, one that went beyond personal power. Monique carried with her a story, a principle she had learned from her grandmother. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come when the rules are tested, when authority is confronted, and when people are forced to confront what they assume to be impossible. And so, when the attendant's sharp command rang through the cabin, Monique's response was both natural and deliberate. It was the culmination of years of preparation, of understanding human behavior, and of mastering the art of timing. The whispers and stunned glances of passengers were just part of the plan, a ripple in a larger wave she had set into motion. Yet, even with all her planning, there was a tension she hadn't anticipated, a subtle, unpredictable variable that would soon surface mid-flight, threatening to turn her calculated statement of authority into something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. At that moment, Monique leaned slightly back, eyes scanning the cabin, as if reading the energy of every passenger. She smiled faintly to herself, confident but alert. What she hadn't revealed was that her journey on this plane wasn't merely about asserting control or teaching a lesson. It was about something far more personal, something rooted in a secret that had followed her across cities, airports, and years. A secret that, if revealed, would shock everyone more than even her bold claim of booking the entire flight ever could. The cabin settled back into a cautious hush, but the air was thick with unease. Passengers shifted nervously in their seats, some pretending to check their phones while stealing glances at Monique, others whispering to companions in hushed tones. Even the seasoned flight attendants, trained to handle difficult situations, seemed unsure how to respond to someone who had, with a single statement, rewritten the rules of authority in an instant. Monique, however, remained calm, poised as if she were merely reading a familiar script that had been written years before. As the plane taxied down the runway, she allowed herself a brief moment to reflect, her mind drifting to the true reason she had orchestrated this flight. It wasn't just a lesson in confidence or control, though those were certainly elements of it. The truth was far more personal. Years ago, Monique had witnessed an injustice that had changed her life, an act of cruelty disguised as routine, a moment when someone had assumed she lacked the means, the courage, or the will to fight back. She had learned that people often measured authority by appearances and money rather than by intelligence, strategy, or resilience. And for years, she had waited for the right moment to reclaim not just respect, but a subtle, undeniable form of justice. The engines roared to life, vibrating under the cabin floor, yet no one seemed to notice beyond the initial distraction of the flight's unusual authority dynamics. Monique's eyes scanned the aisle, nodding small gestures. A child fidgeting nervously in the seat across from her, a businessman clutching a laptop bag a little too tightly, a mother trying to quiet a squirming toddler. Each reaction told her something about human nature, about fear, about pride, and about the fragile way people measure power when confronted with someone who refuses to conform to expectation. She could almost map their thoughts, predicting the subtle panic building in the attendant's chest with every passing moment. The attendant finally spoke, voice trembling slightly now. "Ma'am, I need you to," but Monique raised a hand, a silent gesture that stopped the words midair. She leaned forward, her eyes locking with the attendant's in a way that made the younger woman's knees feel weak. "I understand your rules," Monique said evenly, voice steady and clear, "but rules are only effective when they are enforced fairly. Today, that doesn't apply." The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing a confrontation more complex than they could yet understand. Behind her, a young journalist on the flight scribbled notes furiously in a notebook, certain that she had stumbled upon a story that could go viral, a moment where the ordinary intersected with the extraordinary. The flight attendants exchanged glances, a mixture of frustration and awe, realizing that this wasn't simply about a seat or even a row. It was about a deeper challenge to authority, a subtle yet unmistakable assertion of control over a situation no one could have predicted. And yet, even as Monique maintained the calm exterior that had carried her through years of calculated risks, a ripple of tension traveled through the cabin. A soft chime came from the cockpit door, signaling that the captain had noticed the unusual standoff. Heads turned instinctively toward the front, and Monique allowed herself a very faint smile. She knew that once the cockpit crew realized the extent of her claim, the dynamics on the plane would shift even further. But what no one could anticipate was the real secret hidden in the hold of her carry-on bag, something that, if discovered mid-flight, could turn a simple lesson in authority into a crisis that no one, not even Monique, could fully control. She leaned back slightly, pretending to check her watch, while in reality, her mind traced every possible scenario. This flight, this moment, was only the beginning. The secret she carried wasn't just personal, it had consequences, ramifications that could reach far beyond the narrow cabin walls and into the lives of everyone on board. And as the plane lifted off into the sky, Monique's calm composure masked a storm of calculation, anticipation, and the faintest trace of fear, the kind that comes only when someone is playing a game in which the stakes are far higher than anyone else realizes. Hours into the flight, the cabin had settled into a tense rhythm. The initial shock of Monique's announcement had faded slightly, replaced by curiosity, suspicion, and a growing awareness that something extraordinary was unfolding. Passengers who had initially avoided eye contact now stole glances openly, whispering in clusters, exchanging theories about who she was and why she had booked every seat. The attendant moved along the aisle, clipboard in hand, trying to maintain control, but each step seemed heavier than the last, weighed down by the lingering echo of Monique's calm, unyielding authority. Monique leaned slightly forward in her seat, her fingers resting lightly on the leather armrest, eyes scanning the faces of the passengers with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime reading human behavior. She noticed the subtle signs of fear, fascination, and curiosity, and she allowed herself a small, private smile. Every reaction confirmed her expectations. Years of planning had led to this moment, and the intricate web of preparation she had woven was holding stronger than she could have imagined. Yet even as the plane cruised steadily above the clouds, there was a tension she couldn't shake, a quiet, nagging uncertainty that whispered of variables she hadn't accounted for. It started subtly at first, a soft vibration from her carry-on bag, barely noticeable under the seat, then a slight movement as if someone or something was attempting to draw attention to it. She had anticipated disruptions, questions, and maybe even resistance, but this was different. This wasn't curiosity, it was recognition, a subtle acknowledgement that whatever she carried with her was not meant to be discovered. Monique's mind raced as she calculated the potential fallout, scanning the cabin for anyone who might be watching her too closely. The journalist in the middle rows scribbled furiously, but she didn't yet know what she was looking for. Other passengers were focused on their screens or on the view outside, blissfully unaware that the calm, elegant woman in 14A carried a secret that could change everything. Meanwhile, the attendant, still recovering from her earlier shock, had enlisted a colleague to help navigate the situation. Whispered conversations took place at the front of the cabin, a subtle undercurrent of panic building among the crew. They had never encountered anything like this. A single passenger, composed and unflinching, who effectively neutralized their authority with a few words. The realization began to sink in that Monique's control wasn't just symbolic, it was practical, and no amount of procedure or protocol could undo the effect she had already created. And then the first overt sign of trouble appeared. A sharp beeping echoed from the rear of the plane, drawing everyone's attention. Heads turned instinctively toward Monique, and even the crew froze, uncertain whether it was a technical malfunction or something else entirely. Monique's eyes narrowed slightly, and her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward her bag. She had carried this item with her for years, a piece of her past she had kept hidden from friends, colleagues, and even family. It was more than a personal secret. It was evidence, a key to a truth that she had spent a lifetime protecting, a truth that could explain the audacity behind her current actions. Passengers felt the tension spike as the beeping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Some murmured nervously, others pressed their phones closer to their ears, but Monique remained calm, projecting the same unshakable authority that had dominated the flight since takeoff. Yet beneath that composure, a storm of calculation was brewing. She understood that if this secret were revealed prematurely, it could jeopardize everything, her plan, her lesson, and perhaps even the safety of everyone on board. And then, just as the murmurs reached a fever pitch, the beeping stopped abruptly. A hush fell over the cabin. Monique's hand lingered near her bag, and her eyes flicked toward the cockpit, where the pilot now looked unusually concerned. Something had shifted, an invisible line had been crossed, and the cabin seemed to collectively sense that the ordinary flight they had boarded was no longer just about travel. Somewhere, hidden in plain sight, a truth waited to emerge, one that would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Monique, about authority, and about the ordinary rules that govern life at 30,000 feet. The cabin had grown tense enough that even the hum of the engine seemed to amplify every subtle sound. Passengers shifted in their seats, some gripping armrests, others staring blankly ahead, trying to process the extraordinary situation. Monique's calm presence remained the eye of the storm, yet the small beeping from her bag, though silenced, had left a ripple of unease that could not be ignored. Her secret, long concealed and carefully guarded, had now begun to assert itself, drawing attention in a way she had not fully anticipated. She leaned back slightly, keeping her composure, but her mind worked frantically. The bag contained documents, small items, and carefully hidden evidence from years of injustice, a record of a conspiracy that had once nearly destroyed her life. Those who had wronged her assumed it was gone forever, but Monique had carried it meticulously, waiting for the right time to assert control over her own narrative. Now, flying over hundreds of miles of open sky, the stakes had risen. Any misstep could expose not only her plan, but also the lives of innocent passengers who had no part in her long-fought battle. The attendant, still reeling from the revelation that Monique had booked the entire flight, began packing the aisle nervously. Her earlier authority had evaporated completely, replaced with confusion and a sense of helplessness. Every glance she cast toward Monique seemed to bounce off an invisible shield of confidence. Monique had turned a simple flight into a stage where the ordinary rules of behavior no longer applied, and the attendants were only beginning to grasp the scope of what they were facing. Then a passenger at the rear, a man in a business suit who had been quietly observing the drama, suddenly rose from his seat, attempting to approach Monique. "Ma'am, I don't mean to intrude," he began, his voice wavering slightly, "but can you explain what exactly is going on here?" Monique's eyes flicked toward him, calm yet piercing, and she inclined her head just enough to acknowledge his presence. "Everything you see," she said, her voice deliberate and even, "is exactly what it seems. But what you don't see is far more important." The man froze, the words hitting him with the weight of their ambiguity. Passengers nearby strained to hear, but her tone was steady, controlled, almost hypnotic. The young journalist in the middle rows scribbled faster. Sensing that she was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment that would become a story talked about for years. Others leaned closer, curiosity mixed with apprehension. Monique's words were like threads, weaving a suspenseful narrative without revealing the full picture. She had learned long ago that the power of suggestion often outweighed the impact of revelation. She did not need to explain everything. She only needed to hint, to guide perception, to let tension rise naturally. Suddenly, the small electronic panel above her seat flickered, drawing startled glances from nearby passengers. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but curious. "Cabin crew, please report to row 14. The attendant froze mid-step, exchanging a worried look with her colleague. Monique's eyes twitched ever so slightly, and a faint smile played at her lips. The intercom call was neither a coincidence nor a threat. It was the first real test of how her secret could affect the flight crew. If handled correctly, it would prove her meticulous planning had paid off. If not, it could spiral into chaos. As the plane continued its smooth ascent into the sky, Monique's thoughts turned inward. She knew that revealing the secret too early could provoke fear, panic, or interference, but delaying too long carried its own risks. Somewhere in the balance between control and revelation lay the tipping point, and she had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this. Passengers remained oblivious to the full scope of the drama, yet their reactions, subtle and uncoordinated, were already shaping the unfolding story. The ordinary flight they believed they had boarded had shifted irreversibly into a high-stakes test of courage, perception, and trust, and Monique was at the center of it all, holding the key to a truth that could change everything. And just as a low hum of tension settled over the cabin, the journalist finally noticed a small emblem peeking out from Monique's bag, an emblem that seemed familiar, almost chilling, hinting at a history far darker than anyone on board could yet imagine. Just before we get back to it, take a second to tell me where you're watching from today. And if this story has captured your attention, make sure you subscribe. The cabin air felt heavier now, charged with a tension that went far beyond the usual unease of a crowded flight. Passengers who had been whispering nervously to one another now sat upright, alert, sensing that something far more significant than a seating dispute was unfolding. Monique's calm demeanor remained unchanged, but beneath it, a storm of strategy and caution raged in her mind. Every glance, every gesture she made was deliberate, measured to maintain control while keeping the secret she carried from tipping into chaos. It was the small emblem in her bag that had begun to draw attention, a symbol that, to most, looked like an ordinary corporate logo, but to anyone who knew its history, it carried a weight heavy with consequences. The young journalist who had been observing her most closely suddenly froze, recognizing it from a story buried deep in local archives. The same emblem belonged to a company involved in a scandal that had ruined lives years ago, a scandal that Monique had survived while others had faltered. The revelation, though subtle, sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. Whispers began anew, quieter but sharper, as passengers pieced together fragments of their suspicions. The attendant, now trembling slightly, tried once again to assert control. "Ma'am, we need you to explain what's in your bag," she said, her voice shaking under the pressure of maintaining authority. Monique's eyes met hers, unwavering, almost amused at the attempt. "Everything here is a story waiting to be told," she said softly, "but not yet. Timing is everything." The attendant's frustration was palpable, but she knew, though she would never admit it aloud, that her words carried little weight. Monique had claimed authority in a way that could not be challenged, not without understanding the full scope of her plan, which, for now, remained invisible to the rest of the passengers. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and a subtle hum of engines mixed with the occasional cough or shuffle of restless passengers, but the focus of the cabin remained on Monique. A few brave individuals attempted to approach her, their curiosity stronger than their caution, but each time they did, her calm gaze and precise posture sent them retreating back to their seats, unsure if they were being tested or gently warned. She had mastered the art of influence, an authority that was felt rather than explicitly demanded, and it worked with unnerving effectiveness. Then came the first overt sign that her secret might have consequences beyond social tension. A soft vibration from her bag returned, almost imperceptible, yet enough to cause a nearby passenger to glance suspiciously. Monique's hand hovered near it, but she did not touch it. Instead, she let the small device inside pulse once, a calculated gesture to draw attention without revealing too much. The journalist, eyes wide, began to whisper into her recorder, the realization dawning that this was no ordinary travel story. Somewhere deep in the hidden layers of Monique's past lay the answer to the audacity of booking the entire flight, and this subtle signal hinted that the story was about to escalate in ways that could endanger more than just reputations. In the front of the plane, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but tinged with curiosity. "Cabin crew, please ensure all passengers remain seated. We have a situation developing in the rear of the aircraft." The words carried a weight that only reinforced the growing tension, yet Monique's serene composure remained unshaken. She knew that the moment the flight crew fully understood the significance of what she carried, the entire dynamic of the flight could shift instantly. Passengers clutched their armrests, exchanged nervous glances, and tried to imagine what could be so extraordinary that it required complete control of an entire airplane. The truth, hidden in her bag and in her mind, was far more dangerous and consequential than anyone could have guessed. Monique, aware of the rising anxiety, allowed herself the tiniest smile. The real story, the one that would test courage, challenge assumptions, and reveal hidden truths, was about to unfold, and no one on the plane was prepared for what would happen next. The cabin had descended into a state of quiet unease, where every sound, the rustle of a bag, the murmur of passengers, the faint creak of overhead bins, seemed magnified. Monique sat still, her posture impeccable, yet a subtle shift in the atmosphere made it clear that the secret she carried was no longer just a private matter. It had begun to affect everyone on the plane. The emblem, once unnoticed by most, now drew glances of recognition and unease. The kind of recognition that made people instinctively lean forward in their seats, curiosity mixing with fear. Suddenly, a soft vibration echoed from her bag again, and this time it was impossible for anyone nearby to ignore. A passenger in the row behind her flinched, eyes wide, while the journalist scribbled faster than ever, murmuring under her breath about what she had just seen. Monique's hand hovered for a moment, then she let it rest, her calmness a contrast to the storm brewing around her. She had always known that revealing this secret was a delicate balance. Too soon, and panic could spread; too late, and the opportunity to control the situation could be lost. The attendant, finally regaining some composure but still shaken, approached Monique cautiously. "Ma'am," she said, voice steady but strained, "we need to address whatever is happening with your bag." Monique's eyes met hers, cool and unflinching. "Everything here is part of a story that needs to unfold at the right time," she replied. "Right now we watch, we wait, and we see how it plays out." Her words were calm, almost philosophical, yet the weight behind them was undeniable. Passengers whispered among themselves, sensing that this flight had transformed into something far beyond a routine journey. Questions swirled in their minds. Who was this woman? Why did she need to book an entire flight? What was in the bag that could cause such tension? The young boy by the window pressed closer to his mother, feeling the collective unease of the cabin without fully understanding its cause. For Monique, however, these reactions were part of a carefully orchestrated pattern, a social experiment of human behavior and perception. Then a more urgent signal came from her bag, a subtle click, barely audible, yet unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The journalist's pen froze mid-sentence, and the attendant instinctively took a step back. Monique leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing in concentration, aware that the time to act was approaching. This was not merely about authority or control anymore. The secret she carried had begun to interact with the environment of the plane, touching the lives of the passengers and forcing them to confront a reality they could not yet comprehend. As the plane continued its steady flight, Monique's thoughts turned inward. She recalled the moment she had first acquired the items in her bag, the painstaking effort to protect them, and the quiet determination that had carried her through years of planning and vigilance. Every step she had taken led to this moment, every decision calculated to ensure that when the secret emerged, it would do so with maximum effect. And now, floating thousands of feet above the ground, the balance between revelation and control was more delicate than ever. A sudden movement in the cabin drew her attention. A passenger, emboldened by curiosity, reached toward the bag. The air seemed to shift, charged with the threat of discovery, and Monique's calm exterior did not falter. With a soft, almost imperceptible gesture, she signaled, and the bag settled quietly as if nothing had happened. Yet the tension remained, coiling tighter in the hearts of those around her. They did not yet know the danger, the stakes, or the personal history behind the secret, but the suspense was tangible. Every passenger could feel that something extraordinary was about to be revealed, and no one, not even the flight crew, could stop it. And then, just as murmurs of fear and anticipation grew to a quiet crescendo, a sharp alert sounded from the cockpit, startling the cabin. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "All passengers remain seated. We have a developing situation in the rear." Monique's eyes glimmered with a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. The moment had arrived. The secret was ready to move from shadow into action, and the ordinary flight they had boarded had now transformed into a story none of them would ever forget. The cabin had grown tense to a near unbearable pitch. Whispers had turned into sharp glances, and every passenger now felt the weight of anticipation pressing down, as if the plane itself had become a stage for a drama that none of them could control. Monique's calm exterior remained unchanged, but her mind raced, calculating every possible reaction, every variable, and every way in which her carefully guarded secret could either assert control or spiral into chaos. The journalist in the middle rows had finally leaned close enough to see the emblem clearly and recognized it immediately. She gasped, a sound so sharp it drew attention from several passengers nearby. "That symbol," she whispered to the woman beside her, "it's connected to that company, the one involved in that scandal years ago, the one that ruined so many people's lives." The whisper spread quickly, growing into a ripple of recognition as a few other passengers leaned forward to glimpse the emblem. Murmurs grew into a low hum of tension that seemed to pulse in sync with the engines. Monique shifted slightly, her hand brushing against the edge of her bag. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment when her secret, long hidden, would meet the reality of the people around her. With deliberate slowness, she opened the bag, pulling out a small folder, its edges worn from years of careful handling. The cabin fell silent, every eye now fixed on her. The attendants froze mid-step, realizing that the routine flight had transformed into a revelation none of them had anticipated. The folder contained evidence, documents, photographs, and records, proof of corporate misdeeds, betrayals, and cover-ups that had affected countless lives, including Monique's own. The emblem on the bag was the key, a signal that what was hidden inside carried significance far beyond the ordinary. As she held it up, the weight of history seemed to press into the cabin, the passengers sensing, even without full understanding, that they were witnessing the unveiling of something monumental. A man in the row behind her, previously quiet, suddenly blurted out, "Wait, you're saying you've been carrying all of this?" Monique's gaze met his, calm yet authoritative. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, "and this isn't just my story. It's a lesson about assumptions, authority, and the consequences of ignoring the truth. What you see is the result of years of planning, of patience, and of understanding that the world often underestimates what one determined person can accomplish." The attendant, trembling, stepped forward cautiously. "Ma'am, you need to, you can't just—" Monique held up her hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Control," she said softly, almost philosophically, "is not about rules or titles. It's about timing, understanding, and the courage to act when the moment is right." Her words, precise and deliberate, hung in the air, leaving the cabin in stunned silence. Passengers felt a mixture of fear, awe, and curiosity, realizing that this was no ordinary confrontation. Then, a soft vibration pulsed from the folder itself, a subtle warning Monique had installed years ago to protect the contents. The journalist's pen paused, and the passengers instinctively leaned back, a silent acknowledgement that something larger than all of them was at play. Monique's secret had moved from being a personal safeguard to an active agent in the cabin, dictating tension, curiosity, and awareness in equal measure. As she began to reveal small pieces of the contents, just enough to make the passengers understand that injustice had been hidden for years, the atmosphere shifted entirely. Eyes widened, jaws tightened, and whispers erupted anew, punctuated by sharp intakes of breath. Some passengers felt uneasy, others felt exhilarated. And in the middle of it all, Monique's quiet authority radiated across the cabin, turning fear into understanding, chaos into order, and secrecy into revelation. But just as the first real understanding of her secret settled in the cabin, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice rang out, calm but unmistakably urgent. "Cabin crew, brace yourselves. We have an unexpected complication, and the safety of the aircraft may be at risk." Monique's eyes narrowed, her mind calculating instantly. The story she had been carrying, the lesson she had orchestrated, and the long-hidden secret were about to collide with reality in a way no one could have anticipated. And every passenger now felt, deep down, that nothing about this flight would ever be ordinary again. The calm hum of the engines was now overshadowed by a tension so thick it seemed to press down on every passenger. Monique sat poised, her hands resting lightly on the folder that contained the culmination of years of planning, patience, and resilience. The captain's announcement had drawn nervous gasps from all corners of the cabin, and the flight attendants, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, moved with caution that bordered on fear. Every single passenger was suddenly part of a story far larger than themselves, their ordinary journey transformed into a moment of high-stakes suspense. Monique's secret, once confined to her bag, had begun to interact with the environment of the plane. A series of subtle indicators she had installed years ago, the small vibration, the faint clicking, now signaled that something in the cargo hold, related to the folder she carried, was reacting in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The realization hit her sharply. The secret she had so carefully preserved was no longer passive. It had become an active force, a test not just of authority but of courage, timing, and the ability of those around her to respond under pressure. Passengers leaned forward, some whispering in panic, others holding onto their seats, while the journalist's eyes widened with the realization that she was witnessing the climax of a story decades in the making. Monique's calm composure never wavered, but inside, her mind raced, calculating the possible outcomes. If the situation escalated, the flight could become dangerous, but she had accounted for nearly every variable except human unpredictability, and the tension now came from that very unknown. The attendant approached again, her voice trembling. "Ma'am, please, you have to, this isn't safe." Monique met her gaze, unwavering, and said, "Safety is in clarity and understanding and in knowing the truth. The moment you try to control what you do not understand is when danger truly begins." Her words, calm yet charged, seemed to ripple through the cabin. Some passengers nodded subtly, sensing the weight behind them, while others pressed closer to companions, unsettled by the intensity of her presence. Suddenly, the subtle vibration from the bag became sharper, and the soft hum of machinery from the rear of the plane rose slightly. Monique's eyes flicked toward the cockpit, noting the captain's growing concern. The secret she carried, evidence of injustice, betrayal, and hidden manipulation, was now colliding with the reality of the aircraft itself. The stakes had shifted from symbolic control to tangible consequence, and every passenger could feel the invisible tension tighten around them like a coiled spring. A bold passenger finally rose from their seat, desperation overcoming curiosity. What exactly is in that folder? Why does it matter to all of us?" Monique's gaze met theirs, serene yet piercing. "Because some truths demand to be known," she said softly, "and some lessons cannot be learned until the moment you are forced to confront them." The words sent a shiver through the cabin. Passengers exchanged fearful and awed glances, realizing that what they had witnessed in the first hours of the flight, the calm assertion of authority, the subtle gestures, the whispered warnings, was merely a prelude to the revelation now unfolding. Then the unexpected happened. A sudden jolt shook the plane slightly, not dangerous but enough to cause alarm. The vibration from Monique's bag synchronized with the movement, as if the secret itself were reacting to the motion. Passengers gasped, the attendants froze, and even the journalist's pen faltered. Monique, however, remained composed, her mind racing through contingencies. The critical turning point had arrived. The secret she carried could no longer stay hidden, and the choices she made in the next moments would determine not just the remainder of this flight, but how every passenger would remember it for the rest of their lives. And as the plane steadied, the cabin holding its collective breath, Monique realized something she had not anticipated. Some secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, demand confrontation, and when they do, the ordinary world, the rules, expectations, and assumptions, ceases to exist. The revelation was about to reach its peak, and the ordinary passengers, the crew, and even the journalist were about to discover just how extraordinary this flight had become. The plane hummed steadily, but the cabin was anything but calm. Every passenger was acutely aware that the ordinary rules of flight, of authority, and of personal expectation had been suspended. Monique remained seated, hands resting on the folder that had caused hours of tension, eyes scanning the cabin with a quiet certainty that demanded attention. The vibrations and subtle signals from the bag had long ceased, but the energy in the air had only grown, as if the passengers themselves had become instruments in a story far greater than any of them could have imagined. Slowly, deliberately, Monique opened the folder fully and began to reveal its contents. Photographs, documents, and records detailed a pattern of corruption, manipulation, and betrayal that had affected countless lives, including her own. The emblem that had first caught attention was a symbol of that injustice, a reminder of the people who had assumed she was powerless, who had believed rules and authority were absolute. As she spoke, her words carried a weight that transcended the ordinary, explaining not just the facts but the principle behind them. That courage, persistence, and clarity of purpose could challenge even the most entrenched assumptions. The passengers watched in stunned silence. Some gasped at the scale of what she revealed, others leaned forward, mesmerized by her calm delivery, and a few, older passengers in particular, nodded subtly, sensing a moral truth they had long overlooked. The attendants, who had spent hours trying to assert control over someone they now realized could not be constrained, stood quietly, absorbing the lesson that authority is not merely a title or a procedure, but the ability to act with conviction, even in the face of doubt or fear. Monique's voice, smooth yet powerful, echoed in the cabin. "I booked this entire flight not to show power, but to demonstrate that assumptions are dangerous. People assume rules are always right, that authority is always just, and that individuals cannot affect change. But the truth is, control belongs to those who understand timing, purpose, and the courage to act when the moment arrives." She paused, letting her words sink in. The cabin was silent except for the soft hum of engines and the occasional shuffle of nervous hands. Then came the final revelation, the one that explained everything. The secret she had carried all these years was not just evidence, it was a lesson. She had orchestrated this flight, carefully booking every seat, anticipating reactions and maintaining calm in order to prove that human perception can be reshaped, that courage can redefine authority, and that patience is often the most powerful weapon of all. The folder, the emblem, the subtle signals, they were all tools to teach a single lesson. Never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who has endured, observed, and prepared. Passengers, now fully aware of the depth of her planning and the courage it required, felt a mixture of awe, relief, and inspiration. Some whispered to companions about the extraordinary events they had witnessed, realizing that a single individual's determination could leave a lasting impact on everyone around them. The attendants, who had once tried to impose rules, now understood that Monique's authority came not from status, but from mastery over circumstance and insight into human nature. As the plane began its descent, the energy in the cabin shifted from tension to reflection. Monique leaned back serene, knowing her lesson had landed. The ordinary flight had been transformed into a journey of understanding, and every passenger, whether young or old, had been part of a story that would linger long after they stepped off the plane. Even the young boy by the window had watched closely, learning that confidence, patience, and courage could alter the course of events in ways that rules and assumptions never could. And as the wheels touched the runway and the passengers exhaled collectively, Monique smiled softly, knowing that her secret had fulfilled its purpose. In that moment, the lesson was clear. Authority, respect, and power are earned not through command alone, but through foresight, courage, and the willingness to act decisively when the world underestimates you. The ordinary had become extraordinary, the flight had become a story, and every person on board had learned that sometimes the quietest actions leave the loudest impact. The plane rolled toward the gate, engines slowing, and the passengers prepared to disembark. Yet even as they stepped into the terminal, a lingering sense of awe remained. Monique had not just booked a flight, she had rewritten what it meant to command attention, challenge assumptions, and turn a moment of ordinary life into an unforgettable story. The echoes of her lesson would follow them long after the journey ended, a reminder that courage and preparation often speak louder than authority ever could. That brings us to the end of this story. I'd love to know where you were watching from today, and if this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe for more.